second Data Science Challenges session. And thanks for joining us for the session today. We've got a great panel today, and we'll have some great discussions. Let me talk a little bit about what to expect, what the format will be, then I'll introduce our wonderful volunteer panelists, and we'll get going. So these will be very short talks, 5 minutes each or so, about the challenges that each city, each project is facing. And when we say challenges, we mean two things. So first, what is the city trying to solve, right? What are the problems? And second, what challenges are we facing when you're trying to solve those problems? After each 5 minutes, we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions, and we'll move on to the next one. And then after everybody's done, we can have a general discussion and questions that may relate to more than one project, person, and so on. We have an hour and a half for the session. We don't have to use up the full hour and a half if we are done earlier. So we'll play it by ear depending on how many questions there are, and if it's it seems like a good idea to just kind of mix and mingle at the end rather than having something formal, then we'll just do that. So that's it. My name is Elena Inova. My connection to DSSG goes back a few years. The first year when we started this program 3 years ago, I was one of the first mentors. And we had an amazing year, as I think it has been in the summer, as it has been every year since. And I work at Accenture, or Accenture Analytics, which is the science-y branch of the consulting company. And my background is machine learning, data mining, and data scientist. So 3 years ago, I took a sabbatical from my job. I moved to Chicago to be here for the project. And since then, I've been involved mostly remotely because I can't move to Chicago every summer, sadly. But I'm very pleased to be involved with DSSG and to be helping with things like that. So if you have any questions about DSSG, about data science, social good in general, I'm also happy to answer. All right. With that, let's get started with the talks. So we've got 5 short talks today, and this is the order that we're going to do with. So first we have Lee Tammy from the City of Cincinnati. We've got Sam Edelstein, City of Syracuse. Mike Fuller from, make sure I get that right, Muskingum Valley Education Service Center.
Good.
All right. I practiced all the names, but not the organization. Matt Pazzolas and Nick Haji George. Matt is from What Works Cities, City of Fort Lauderdale, and Nick is from What Works Cities, Jackson. All right, welcome, yes. Thank you. And let's get started. Great, take it away.
All right. So, said I'm Lee Tammy. I'm from the City of Cincinnati. So I focused, when I was preparing for this, I focused a lot on the latter area, not the former so much, but actually yesterday in Cincinnati we had an all-time high of heroin overdoses, which is hugely problematic for a lot of obvious reasons. So I think one problem that sort of I would identify as enormous in our midst is heroin use, and thinking about what interventions are most appropriate in terms of who is doing them, in terms of how we're facilitating them, and in terms of how we're preventing overdoses, how we're preventing heroin use in the first place. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. I think that's more or less self-evident, but when I just through my work with the City of Cincinnati, with our public safety, our fire department is here with us. But I kind of identified as I have sort of 3 issue areas in terms of where I think it's difficult to incorporate data science with operations. So these are all based on my experience. The first is that the starting point has to be relationship building. I found that walking into departments and saying, we have this great, we looked at your data, we have this really great analysis is pretty unsuccessful. Number one, because they either feel threatened, they don't understand necessarily what you're saying, not because they can't, but because you're doing something differently than how they've been doing it before. In my experience, getting buy-in for what we're doing from departments who ultimately have to implement these insights difficult if you kind of come in with that posture. I've found that we get a lot more credibility when we walk in and go on ride-alongs or ask how they do their work or what they're doing, much more so than, you know, we built this model for you, or we've looked at your data and these are our assumptions and this is where we're going from here. I found that that is not, that's I think a difficult thing for someone who has a data analysis or data science background to sort of get his or her mind around. The second thing that I think is a huge issue is that in government we juggle a lot of diverse interests. So a great example of this is with our project that we're doing this year with Data Science for Social Good. We worked on the EMS project for trying to deploy medic units faster. So when you look at our data, one of the first most obvious insights that appears is, well, if you had a more dynamic shift model, you could move people around more quickly. A lot of these things could be solved. Well, we have our labor relations are union-based, and regardless of whether you like unions or don't like unions, they exist for an important reason, which is to protect worker interests. So whether that's manifests well or is manifests poorly, that means that we have to come up with more creative solutions that can work around that. So I think that's something that's really hard, because a lot of these things, when you look at the data appear, they're really obvious. Oh, if we could shift people, if we could shift how we staff, things would be so much better, and that's probably true, but that's a construct that we just don't have the luxury of sort of using. Excuse me. I think the third challenge that I've sort of identified is the data analysis, data science has to feel accessible for people that actually do the work. I think that even when they understand why it's happening, or they understand the premise behind it, if you don't have people on the front lines or near the front lines actually feeling like they can do analysis or they can engage with analysis, it still falls in this black box of like technology, or which is sort of an unknown. And I think part of how I see my role, and frankly I see the role of data science as an endeavor for social good, I think a big part of that role is making data analysis really accessible, making people feel like this is something they can actually use as a tool for managing projects, as a tool for measuring performance. They don't need to come to my office to use this. They don't need to come to my office to understand this. This is their data, this is their operation, this is their stuff. I'm just there to sort of facilitate the use of another tool that's kind of at their disposal. So that's pretty much what I have on this front, pretty quick.
That's great. And can you talk a little bit about the project? How far along is it?
But with the EMS,
Yeah.
our EMS project, yeah. So I think it's essentially what our fellows identified were. We focused a lot on different kinds of incidents where. Well, let me back up. The flip side, when we look at incidents and we say this is, using our model, we could have gotten to these incidents faster. We could have saved lives. The way that we're doing that is looking at incidents where we deployed medic units where we didn't actually need a transport. So that's important because number one, we have a limited number of medic units. We only have 12. That's the reality that right now we have to work around. And number two, just because a medic unit isn't there doesn't mean that medical care is not there. So the question really becomes not does this person need medical care? The assumption is yes. It becomes does this person need to be in a hospital facility as soon as possible? Is that sort of a condition of what's going on here? So I think we have identified in the model that the students or the fellows have been working on for us, we've identified tweaks that we can make in in deployment protocol for different kinds of incidents. We've identified either kind of questions we can ask at intake that will clarify the severity of the incident and what the deployment model should be based on how that's trended historically. So I think we're at a point where we can take what they've done and just start testing it and saying, in this case, we're gonna try this for a day or something and see how many of these incidents that we predicted wouldn't need a transport ended up calling it later.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll kind of give us a sense of on the ground how this actually is working. So I think we're relatively far along. I think that we are ready to do some implementations and testing, and then we'll go from there.
Let's get some questions for Lee?
What do you think the biggest challenge would be to implement their model in since you've seen it from experience, what do you think the biggest challenge would be to actually implement it?
Training. So a lot of the premises require it's a different deployment model or a different deployment protocol for certain kinds of incidents, which means two things. Number one, your call takers might have to ask different questions, which changes their ProQA, their protocol for what they say when they answer calls. And you have to train the dispatchers on what the protocols are that are associated with the new codes. To be totally clear, call taking and dispatching are really stressful jobs to begin with. You kind of hear people that are going through just horrendous things on the phone. You have to kind of figure out what's going on, collect information, pass it to dispatch, figure out who's available, send units out. So I think that it's a challenging job to begin with, basically training employees and saying we're going to restructure this or we're going to do this for a day, basically creating room to test it and figure out what are we going to do next. I think it's definitely the most challenging part.
You mentioned the black box of data science, and I think that's a concern that's felt by a lot of people who work in this area and who are familiar with how to run models and how to evaluate models. What are some of, or are there common questions that you get from, say, dispatchers or call takers or other stakeholders who, when you're explaining this work to them, what sort of questions do they ask? What sort of questions do you think they're not asking?
So a lot of them don't ask questions, which I think is actually tells a lot more. So a lot of people don't ask questions about what assumptions I made when I built a model, which means that the fact that I made assumptions at all is not evident in the process and in what I'm presenting. I think that's a huge problem. Number one, because, and this is something I think people don't understand about technology, it's only as valuable as what you put into it, right? Technology is useful because it automates processes, but you have to understand what it's automating before you understand what the output will be. So I think that the fact that people don't often ask me, what are your assumptions, or why did it, did you account for this, or did you account for this? That tells me that there's sort of this disconnect between what I did to get to this point and what it's outputting. So I would say that kind of tells me more about that. That being said, when I start talking about assumptions, then it feels more accessible, right? Because they understand this isn't sort of this like magic thing that I'm doing or that I've thought of. It's this and this and this, and when you do this and these things, this happens, or this is the output, or this is the prediction, or this is what we notice. That's been sort of the most successful way for me to have that conversation.
That's very important.
So I was really happy to hear you talk about the first challenge was getting buy-in. So I'm curious to know, it seems like you could have a really big difference between an EMS director who's really excited about analytics and the call taker who's like, and you want me to do my job differently? And I'm just curious about how you approach what might be two different types of stakeholder engagement. Maybe it's three types. Maybe it's like, mayor, city manager, EMS director, mid-manager, frontline, like even the people in the ambulances. I don't know, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this, part of the way that my office is structured is we're structured to sort of address that. So what I have my analysts do, the first thing I have them do before they do any analysis is go in and do like ride-alongs with operation. I don't want them even looking at data before they do that. Number one, because that I feel it will inevitably sort of skew what comes out of it for them. And number two, I think it's important that before they start having conversations about analysis or data or these are the variables that people feel like they care what they do. That a call taker feels like this person is actually interested in learning how this works. This person is actually here to try to learn something rather than to try to sort of confirm a bias that he or she had in the first place. So I think that on that level, there's a lot of that might be actually the most important relationship building level as far as getting buy-in and saying we're not here to displace you. We're not doing this because we don't want you here doing your job. We're doing this because we're trying to make what you do easier and frankly more meaningful for you. We're trying to eliminate some of some of the redundancy or the busier work that you're doing. As far as directors, I'd say that for middle management, I think that's harder because, at least in my experience at that level, a lot of those people carry a lot of responsibility but don't have a lot of room to make change, and that is difficult. So I think the way that I interact with a lot of either directors or like supervisors or middle managers is say, look, I see that this is really challenging for you and you have a lot to manage and you don't necessarily have a lot of tools to do it with. So probably the first analytical tool or project that I'll have my analysts do is something that will help that person actually manage what they're doing, because that way they see, oh, this is a beneficial thing. You're not doing this to show me what I'm doing wrong. You're doing this to help me do my job. I think that's a really critical component of buy-in at that level. And then I think as far as the executive level, it's really about saying this is how this output relates to this outcome. I think when you get to a higher level, that's where talking about performance, at this point, at least in my experience, helps sometimes rather than talking about data, because you can say, look, data, it produces this output kind of escalates to this performance outcome, and that's why what we're doing is important. So I don't know if that answers what you were asking. Great.
Great. I'm happy to see so many questions. Maybe, okay, one more, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. And then there'll be more time for questions at the end.
I'll make it very quick. So obviously EMS, you're dealing with essential government services, right? Life or death situations in some cases. Doing something different, right? Doing something different than the way it's always been done inherently presents some risk, right? There's a risk that you could deploy a fire truck when an ambulance is needed. How do you plan to hedge against that risk at the kind of city level?
Do you, in terms of how we build the model, or what is my plan for sort of selling that?
Yeah,
and
maybe
the risk?
a contingency plan, so to speak, if, God forbid, a situation went bad with the prediction.
No, yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's two parts of that. A couple, or I think at least one of our fellows are here. Something that they were really great about building into our model was they weighted the different incidents. So they said, what incidents does it, even at 10% of the time, you actually need a medic unit, or there's some incidents where you don't want to take chances. So that's built in. A great example of that is if we have a structure fire. We almost never need a medic unit at a structure fire, but if we do, it's because a firefighter is down, and that firefighter needs to be in a hospital, immediately. So part of the way that we structured this was saying there are some incidents, there are some things we're not going to mess with. We're not going to touch this because this is too critical. There are other areas where historically what we do, either we send a medic unit and half the time we don't need one, or first of all, they're not as critical incidents. We're not doing this with like heart attacks, or like I said, with these structure fires. We're trying to say, this is an area where we're not sure that we've been optimizing what we have to begin with. So, and the risk is lower, if you will. We're not, nobody's gonna like bleed out while we are testing whether or not we should be sending a medic transport. So, so I think in that sense, it's kind of saying, first of all, this is the risk that we are able to mitigate and that we have mitigated. And secondly, these are areas where, if we're being honest with ourselves, we're not sure what the outcomes have been. Historically, we are open to kind of looking at how else we can do this, and we're gonna document what we're doing, gauge where we're successful and where we're not, and we're gonna go from there.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Next, we've got Sam Edelstein, Syracuse.
Hi, I'm Sam Edelstein from the city of Syracuse. And I thought that I'd talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we haven't tackled through this program, but also use the project that we did here as kind of a way to talk about some of the challenges of why we maybe can't, or why some of the other projects that we're doing could be difficult. Earlier this year, sometime last year, City of Syracuse was named as the worst city in the country in terms of concentrated poverty for minority residents. So poverty, issues related to poverty are at the top of our mind. I think constantly it's a major issue that the mayor is concerned about. There are several different groups throughout the city that focus on it, hundreds of nonprofit organizations. The university is a part of trying to figure things out. So something that we all pay attention to, but not an easy problem to solve. I was disappointed yesterday when Ray said that machine learning can't just solve poverty for us. so I think what we need to, so part of what we need to think about is like, how could we make this a smaller problem, so that we could sort of tackle tiny little pieces of it. I think with the project that we did here, which was focusing on putting a risk score to water mains to predict whether they might be at risk of breaking over the next few years, that was like a relatively small scope. It's, you know, is the thing gonna break or is it not? But even that was difficult to sort of get our heads around, to think about all the different contingencies. We talked a lot with our fellows about sort of how do we make sure that the data is correct. There were issues around, you know, what does a water main break actually mean? Is a leak a water main break? Is you know, does it only count when the road implodes and you have you know, major outages? So so even with that was difficult, and we had 3 fellows who are really bright and well trained, who are working, you know, 40 hours a week for 3 months, and based on the commits that they made to their GitHub repo at 2 o'clock in the morning, I know they were working way more than 40 hours a week a lot of the time. So, you know, so I think when we have tried projects like this before, one of the challenges is sort of really defining that scope and figuring out like what data is needed. So we've tried to do predicting vacant housing rates, and you know, we worked with a class of students that was sort of being trained in data mining and machine learning during the time, and like we didn't really have the project scoped out. We didn't know what we wanted. We didn't know what the output should be, and we didn't have the data to supply. So what we find, I think, as we go forward and try and tackle issues of poverty is like, what does that even mean? Are we going to look at our vacant housing, and do we even know which houses are vacant? How are we identifying those? How do we count a vacant house that, you know, someone would say it's vacant because someone is getting out of Syracuse for the winter and they're in Florida? It's a concern for the fire department, but maybe not so much for housing values. And it actually might be like better for the neighborhood, because it means that there are people living in the neighborhood who can go and like take the winter and live somewhere else. So how do we like parse, you know, vacationers versus homes that are legitimately vacant and people aren't living there anymore? So how do we know that for sure? You know, are we looking at trends, and are we seeing how have these things changed over history? You know, do we even know that this same house is the same house as before, when we have issues between our assessment office that considers properties as one thing and our zoning office that considers a property as something else, based on the way that they've been split apart or combined, you know, throughout history. So addresses are different. So how do we know that this one specific house is the same thing across all of the data sets that we have? And then additionally, especially for a problem like poverty, you know, as I mentioned, we have nonprofits working in this space, we have the city working in this space, we have the county working in this space, state government, federal government, all these different places are working on these problems, and we all have data. None of it looks the same. You know, and like I said, even addresses, it's really hard to combine the number of ways that we talk about, like the 200 block of Main Street in Syracuse, which isn't a real block, but that sort of thing, is frustrating and makes it really difficult to do simple things like how do we merge two different tables of a database together from different sources. And so I think when we think about some of those things, you know, relating it back to our relatively well scoped out project with water main breaks in the city, it's just hard to sort of think about how do we take all of this other data from different sources, and how do we make some real change here. I think there is a lot of opportunity. You know, we know generally there is some answer about where people are receiving services, what sort of access do they have to get to those buildings, which houses are vacant, who's renting, who's not. But I think you know, yesterday at the fireside chat, DJ Patil was talking about sort of the issue of slow ETL, and you know, when you can't get information from one database to another quickly, or combine those things, then you are inefficient and you're missing out on some intelligence that you might otherwise have. So that's really a lot of what we're trying to tackle, I think, is like, how do we count properly? How do we know for sure that we're talking about the right things? And then how do we also make sure that, you know, I think a lot of what was talked about yesterday is like, the talents that you all have to be able to apply some of these models to really distinct problems is powerful and exciting, but it isn't going to tackle poverty. It's maybe going to tackle, how do we assess a specific issue in a specific neighborhood over a specific period of time, given that we have all of this, previous data to hopefully project out into the future. And that's hard. That takes a lot of time, and we don't necessarily have the staff that can step back and think about it. And I think the potential benefit of it is out. It sometimes will get us excited about taking on a project that maybe we haven't really thought out well enough. So I think seeing the progress that we've made relative to water main breaks helps me at least think about like this is really how we have to get our work in order and our stuff in order so that we could partner with DSSG again, so that we could work with Syracuse University, so that we could hire more people to do work on these projects. But not taking that lightly. And I think really spending a lot of the time to talk about a lot of the things that Lee was talking about as well, like getting that buy-in, making sure that we know, have data dictionaries and know exactly what we're talking about with all of the different data. So those are a lot of the challenges that we face.
You both kind of talk about this evolutionary approach, building relationships and everything. I'm kind of curious what success have you seen outside of your office, your people, with the larger city? I mean, what are your thoughts on how you institutionalize this more of this knowledge so that people don't just think of it as a black box or that this is a resource for them? How are you, is there any success that way in like getting people on board in a meaningful way so it's not just about, oh, now the black box will do everything for me, like understanding the risks and the complications as well as the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is sort of similar to what Lee was saying, where a lot of times those questions aren't asked, and so I will sort of voluntarily be like, hold on, there are assumptions here. You guys like can't just think that I'm like knowing what I'm talking about all the time. Like I've made a lot of guesses about things that I think are right, but you need to tell me where I'm wrong. And like a lot of this needs to be tested, right? Like even we have 3 PhDs working on this problem that we have. They very much tell us like, please do not go and tell people that this is perfect because it's not, and there are assumptions that they've made and that we've made, giving the data to them. So that like doesn't totally answer what you were asking, but I think generally it is kind of setting the bar about what you can expect. And then I think getting back to more of what I was talking about is getting a sense that we're like counting correctly and like Lee was saying again, like let's not input bad data here. Let's make sure that we do know what we're talking about so that we acknowledge that there are differences between the types of vacant housing and that like the fire department may care differently about a vacant house than a neighborhood office because like fire department may be much more worried about that house that's vacant for the weekend because there could be a fire there that nobody's paying attention to. Neighborhood office may not care. And so I think if we can sort of distill those kind of problems, then we can get to the point of where things are. But generally, I think people are just hopeful, but also don't have a huge knowledge of how it works, but are hopeful that like there are people who can sort of help them get that going. So that's where it is today, but we're still very much at like the entry point to it. I think if we got it more institutionalized, where we're doing lots and lots of these projects, and we just take over all the projects that are happening here. That then there might be more to it, but I think we're still at the point where it's like, look, this is something that we can do. Data is an asset that we can use. It's not just stuff on paper. Like those spreadsheets actually have other meaning, and so let's see what we can do with it. And like, here's the results that we can show.
To sort of step back a little, I mean, the problem you were talking about in general is poverty in general. And so then you went on to like empty houses and something. What are you correlating? Is it to say it's a strong poverty area, but we want to make sure that there's still city services are efficient and appropriate for that area? It's like, what is the tie into quote unquote poverty to find out just water main breaks? I mean, or are you correlating that to economic activity somehow? I mean, I'm curious.
This is a great question that we are struggling with constantly, and part of the issue is like, what data do we go and look at, right? And so beyond the fact that like we may not know every single business and every single census block tract, we also, there's also a lot of data about everything, so how do you find those correlations? You know, it would be awesome if we could just throw all of it at some unsupervised learning model that said like, here are your things, you know, focus on these things, but like, either that's not realistic, or we don't have the talent on staff to figure out how to make that work. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's part of what we're doing and trying to make decisions about what do we ultimately have the most impact on, could we have the most impact on, and then how do we identify, like, how do we make the choice about this is, you know, we think that we can influence something having to do with taking care of vacant housing. So let's look at all the different things that might go into it that we feel good about the data, that then we can maybe change some policy on.
So I was just wondering, I mean, then, do you then reach out to community groups, residents, and maybe potential interested developers and saying, what do you need to see, and then start to marry data to what might potentially be impactful to someone saying, I got money, but this is what I hear, and I really don't want to plop my money down, or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that'll be part of the progress that we'll hopefully be able to make. But again, that does then get back to, you know, how have those specific organizations reported on things and that sort of thing. So I think that's the difficulty with all of it. And then add to the point that like water main breaks, they do affect people, but they aren't people. Like poverty is really affecting people. So I think taking that extra step to really consider like impact there probably has a lot more significance relatively, although we probably also can't impact it quite as much as we might be able to decide which water main are we gonna replace.
So with vacant housing, let's say you have a perfect system that identifies the vacant houses, what's next?
Yeah, I think so. So my hope is that we do go around and rate them, and so we have a sense of like on a scale of 1 to 5 that may or may not be great, but we have a scale of sort of where are they in terms of how good they are. So my hope, we don't have enough money to demolish them. We don't have enough money to refurbish them. A lot of them just sit and sort of get worse and worse and worse. And so my hope is what we can do is say, you know, a vacant house has some impact on a neighborhood. So can we quantify that? Then can we see like how much lost revenue essentially does the city experience from having a vacant house? Like if it's lowering housing values on that street, then there is some sort of lost revenue. There's also some sort of impact on the people that live on that lot. So can we quantify that? And then can we start to figure out like what's the long-term value of refurbishing the house versus demolishing it? Are there certain houses where we're at sort of like a tipping point where it would be much more doable to refurbish a house today rather than a year from now, so we need to do something today? And then could we incentivize a developer to come in and say, do this now because it's gonna get way more expensive and you're not gonna want it, and it'll continue to have like a negative effect on our city. So I don't know exactly how possible that is, but that's sort of my thought is like, if we're focusing on vacant housing, we should have a sort of evidence-based way of approaching how we are dealing with them. That includes a lot of different markers to determine like what's the right way of going about it.
Great. Oh, wow. Lots of questions. Correct.
I'd be curious to hear more about your thoughts on the main barriers to doing more of this work in-house on a consistent basis. Seems like the team's done great work with 3 or 4 people full-time 3 months. Most data teams I hear about are like 2 people on 10 projects for an entire agency. And whether it's a budget issue or a hiring issue or a buy-in issue or something else, we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We have a lot of talented people who do a lot of good data work with the city, but I think a lot of times they're very siloed, and so they work on you know, very specific neighborhood issues or very specific water system issues or that sort of thing. And one of the things that we did pretty early on was like just merge a couple of different data sets and like throw it up onto a map and show like, here's where water main breaks have happened and here's where roads are bad. And it wasn't even all that complicated of a thing that we did, but now, you know, we'd be able to do even more improvement to that. But nobody ever did that, I think, because there just isn't, people are busy and there isn't a lot of communication. So in some ways there's probably a need for just more training and, you know, getting a sense of like, here's how you could use Excel Excel or more advanced tools to do some of your work. But in other ways, I think it's just like having a more global approach to some specific projects and getting a sense of like, let's centralize all data or specific sets of data and figure out where some of those common identifiers are so that we could merge them, think about governance issues. So like, let's make sure that we do have consistent addressing so that we can combine some of those things. So some of that just hasn't necessarily been thought about, and hopefully we're moving that direction so that we can get more that way. But I think it's a variety of things, but generally, I think most of it is probably just that we all work in different departments, and so thinking about things outside of our department doesn't always happen.
All right, let's do one last question, and then we'll move on, and the rest we'll do at the end. Yeah.
There has been we have this notion in the air that tackling poverty is too nebulous to do it. Do you have any key performance indicators, like for the city or for like you specifically, your department?
About what it would look like to like improve the poverty. Yeah, I don't know. We're still getting there, I think. I mean, that is part of the challenge, I think, is talking through like, so there are differences, I think, between the level of government and what that level of government would say. Like, we might have a hope and we might want to measure things that we don't have a huge amount of control over, but just to get a sense of what things are. So for instance, like, we don't distribute food stamps, and we don't have like a health department that's all county run or state run, and and so we may care about that because that could influence some of our work, but we probably wouldn't put a KPI on it because maybe we don't have a lot of influence over it. But so things like maybe vacant houses, maybe we look at even like access to the services. So this isn't a city-run thing, but we have like a one-stop shop for finding a job, and it's in one place in the city. It's open from 9 to 5. The buses don't run there, consistently. And if you are someone who is working an hourly job and you are underemployed and want a better job, you may not be able to access that. So could we think about like how many people are able to access these services, even if it's not how many people are accessing these services, but how many are able to? If we considered like reasonable access is that there would be a bus available after work hours, or you live within a mile of a place or something. So then we could think about how do we better deploy resources to our community centers or that sort of thing, so that there's more access. I think that's kind of what we look for, but a lot of that it's not necessarily gonna be causal for improvement or reduction of poverty. It might be a correlation that we're looking at and just hoping that that's where it goes, and so I think that's kind of what I guess that.
Okay. All right. We've got Mike Fuller, Muscatine Valley Education Service Center.
Good morning, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I know that sometimes when I'm sitting in the back, I saw lips moving, but I didn't hear anything coming from that like that.
We have microphones available.
Yeah, if there's a need like that. I'm a psychologist by training, and I was trained, if you will, in a classical model, which is trained as an academic first, and then trained as a practitioner. And so I have my feet in both worlds, and that helps me. But I spent a good part of my career in public education, in the schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. Part of my own background as a psychologist was that they inculcated in me this notion about advocacy for kids. So you advocate for the kid. So a kid has an issue, and you want to try to determine what's the best solution for that kid in the context of a team. So it was advocacy. They really pushed advocacy in terms of through my training and even now in my mindset. I went into the schools, and I've been at it for a while now, and what I found in public schools is that there's a whole bunch of data that is largely inaccessible to 99% of educators for a lot of reasons. Data is basically collected, and it's pushed up. It's pushed up to these intermediate kind of warehouses, and then the identification pieces are stripped off of the data, and then it's pushed up to the state. And when it's pushed up to the state, what they do is they aggregate the data for various kinds of reporting. You got federal reports and state reports and this and that. But the data never really comes back to the districts in any kind of useful form except reports, gotcha kind of data, if you will. So back in the day, I knew that the data was being pushed out. And it, my own kind of thinking, I said, well, if the data gets pushed this way, why can't it get pushed this way? And so I started asking questions about, well, if it goes there, can't we return it here? And I spent years knocking on doors, trying to convince people that had the data, they locked it down tighter than Fort Knox, and they would ask me questions about, well, why do you want the data? Well, what are you going to do with the data? Are you sure you're, like that? And it really was a battle in terms of saying that we can do something productive with the data. They had no confidence in that. So the people that were warehousing the data were not really data analysts, they were prison guards, like that. And they were told that you better not let this data go out to anybody or you're going to lose your job. And honestly, it really came down to the fact that I had to go and get, well, what's your policy on this? Because sometimes people overinterpret policy. What's the state statute on this? And then I had to bring in the big guns. That's not your data, that's the school's data, the superintendent and so on like that. So, it unfortunately, it was an adversarial kind of process after a while because they just were not going to open that door. Well, after a while, they started opening that door. And they started letting the data come out. Not really in buckets, but in trickles. What do you want? Oh, I want this. Okay, it was sort of like a supermarket. I'd like to have some oranges. You got no oranges sitting on the thing like that. Somebody would run in the back and grab me a couple oranges and bring it out. I didn't want it that way. I wanted to reach in and grab and pull when I wanted. I wanted to have the queries. Now when I say let me back up here. It ain't me. It's a team of people that I work with like that. I have a very robust team that have people who know how to get at data. They know how to clean and fetch and all that other kinds of stuff with data and everything else I get. I just have harebrained ideas. And they're the ones. They're the ones that make it happen. But I kept pounding on that door, getting that data out, getting it out in little bits and everything else I get. And then we started using the data. Now, again, the kinds of things you guys are talking about here, in the school world, this kind of mentality doesn't exist. In schools of education across the United States, educators are trained to look at data largely as a test score. A kid performed at the 5th percentile. We're weak in this content strand, like that. So they're trained to look at data in that respect. That's their mindset about data. How many kids performed well? How many kids didn't perform well? They don't have the view of yesterday. In fact, some educators don't want to know about that kid because in their mind they think it's prejudicial. They don't have the long view. If you're in the 4th grade, you have no idea what happened in the 8th grade with that kid. None. All you know is that he was at the 30th percentile in the 4th grade and you did something. So they're not even thinking about the myriad data, the integration of data, how you can take that data, tie it together, and it informs things now and allows you to track interventions down the road. So what we did, my team, people who know what to do, like that, we pulled this data out. So literally we have more than 10 years of longitudinally integrated data. I have data on kids who were in preschool, who are now in college. And what we're able to do is we're able, path analysis, we're able to follow the progress of kids over time. And we're able to look back. So if kids are enrolled in college right now, who are they? What was their high school curriculum like? What were characteristics about them demographically and so on like that? We can ask questions that largely could not be asked or answered before that. So to bring you back to this project, so we sit on one of the most integrated, clean, complete, compelling, longitudinal data in Ohio, in the education world. We do. We do a lot with that. We can send and help teachers look at data and so on like this. We can do that. But I knew there was more. And so I heard about this crazy things you guys are doing here at Chicago and everything else like that, and we wrote a proposal. What I would like is that my training is, again, in more the classical kinds of ways of looking at statistics, I wanted to say, can we reliably identify students early on who are at risk of not graduating within 4 years of entering high school like that? That is not a trivial thing. Because right now, in my area, I got 32,000 kids that we serve. Roughly 10% of them will not graduate within 4 years upon entering high school. Now, they'll say, well, within 5 years. Well, that's all cool. But here's what you have to know. It's a cost to the system, it's a cost to the kid. A cost to the system. For every extra year a kid is in the system, that's a $10,000 penalty. That's what it costs. You take 3,000 kids, you multiply by 10,000, you're talking about $30 million that's not available to that system for something else. So, I want to have something that's relatively sensitive, that doesn't over-identify. I don't want to say this kid, ain't going to graduate, I don't want to stamp him like that. But I want to say there's something different about that kid, that the data suggests we ought to take a harder look. So some of you guys are concerned about that black box. Educators are never going to understand this. I'm not going to spend my time trying to explain this stuff to them. What I'm going to do is I'm saying we have an index that suggests maybe we need to take another look at this kid. You're a professional. What do you think? And if we can have some agreement, yeah, well, like that. Then what we do is we have available, the next thing out of this was not just to grab a means to say this kid is high risk. Well, now that he's high risk, what are you going to do about it? And so what we are doing, our next step here with our data, is that once we have we get some more validation to do what they've done with this, because they've taken our model down to 5th grade, which is pretty cool. The next thing we're doing now is that we have electronic means to say, this kid was identified, this team met, this is what they considered, these were the interventions, and all this stuff is coded and put into things. And then we could track over time what the progress of that kid is. So I can look at the end of this grading period, doing any better? I can look next year, doing any better? Is the kid staying in an at-risk kind of thing? Because the model that these folks developed for us is that next year we'll rerun it. And we'll like that. And what I'd like to see is that if this kid in the 5th grade came up high risk, I'd like to see in the 6th grade, based on our interventions, that metric changed, that he's less risk like that. And so what Chicago's done for us is really taken us to a level where we have some high-power metrics that we think have great utility, that we can use to identify, help teachers to identify. Teachers have no problem identifying the kid that's tearing up the classroom, that's not coming to school, that's failing courses. They got no problem identifying those. You don't got to get a risk score. I know. But there's a lot of kids out there that never reach that threshold that are in trouble. Kids who don't graduate on time, they start disengaging from school early on. They don't make the decision come 9th grade, we're bailing. They disengage early on, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade. They don't work as hard. They don't persist with tough things. There are things about them that are characterologically different. We can tap that without being prejudicial, provide some bump in their trajectory. We think we can do some things to offer them some benefit. So they gave us a model, pretty good model. We're going to validate it. At the same time, we have this whole intervention array that's web-enabled, that we can sit there and monitor performance over time. And so we think we're going to take this to another level.
Great, thank you. More questions? Wow, I love seeing somebody who hasn't asked a question yet.
I guess, and this is really in some way, I'm concerned about domain expertise. I'm concerned when I'm hearing these poverty, and I come from a university, so I'm an academic geek, but there are a lot of people who look at issues of poverty, and part of me wants to say, you need some other kinds of people at the table to talk. And in this one, I guess it's the same thing, domain. I'm glad teachers are engaged, but I'm concerned about the way this is talked about, because it's always brought back to the kid as the problem instead of the structure of the education. And it may not be, it could be red flagging how you're educating kids or how kids are being brought into schools, not about the kids. And it starts to ring to me a lot about profiling kids rather than looking at the structure, or considering that there are other issues, not just that the kid is not.
Yeah, and if I conveyed that I entirely did not mean to do that, because what we do is we practice within a team environment. We believe in wraparound services. As a psychologist, I know there are lots of things that impinge on a student's success. I never blame a kid for the circumstance that he's in, even if he's acting out like that. There are things that impinge on that child's performance. Home things, school things, peer things, just the whole thing. When we say this kid based on this risk index, because this risk index that we have isn't the kind of usual characteristic that's in the literature. The literature says 18 days you miss a year like that, you're at high risk like that. So many incidents of out-of-school suspension, you're at risk like that. It's sort of a blanket. The method that they went through took all that data and began putting it together like that. They created these unique kind of things about this kid that suggest maybe we ought to take another look. So when you take another look at this kid, the teacher says, you know, parents are going through a divorce right now. They've been that sort of thing else like that. You know, this is the third school this kid has been in the last 2 years like that. Or this kid is in foster care. So what they do is they really enrich the picture of the kid, because that's going to dictate what the circumstance is in terms of intervention. So if a kid is a hellion in the classroom, you just don't write a behavior program and saying, okay, we're going to consecrate the kid for acting out. You look contextually, familial, and so on.
But let me just flip that around quickly and say that and I'm going to totally make this up. This has no grounding in any data of any sort that I know of. What if you instead turned around and started to look at what groups of kids ended up being at high risk, and it may be the school does not accommodate children who are foster kids, that the services aren't in place. So it's not about looking at the kid holistically, it's actually looking at the system. I guess I just want to challenge this idea that we're
See, I don't see that as an either
red
or.
flagging
I don't see that as an
people.
either or. I see that, you know, that this
Okay.
multiple view about what determines an outcome is necessary.
Yeah.
So that, you know, sometimes it's easy to run to an area like that, but again, you know, in systems thinking, you look at the totality of things like that. And there are some systems out there that are toxic to kids' well-being. It's clear. You know, it happens
They're
like
deep
that.
structural.
And it could be a home system, it could be a school system, and so on like that. So you're aware of that. In our intervention kinds of things like that, hopefully those kinds of things will, you know, will present. But for me, because what I do is we try to think big, we act small. And so what I want right now, it's a small thing here, is that can we reliably, without being prejudicial, without saying, this kid is, you know, he's hell-bent on dropping out of school. Can I do something that might bump that kid from the trajectory? Now, what is that something? That something's a number of things. But what I like to do too is that when we're looking at how we database these interventions, I'd like to follow that over time. What worked, what didn't work? Which schools are more successful at this, which aren't? Those sorts of things like that. So there's a whole array of things that you can look at that might be, you know, helpful here. But I understand your point, and you know, I guess my point here too, coming from where it says I was as an advocate of a child, the advocacy of a child for me never blames the kid. The kid is oftentimes a victim of the circumstances he or she is in. So thanks for the question.
All right, thanks. Got about 15 minutes per speaker so far. We only have half an hour left, so I don't want to shortchange you guys at the end. So let's go to the next one and then questions at the end. And we have a half an hour break for the next session, so you guys can also stay on there and have a seat there. Next, we've got Matt Pozzolis from What Works Cities and City of Fort Lauderdale.
Great. Hi, everybody. So just to give you a little bit of background about what Work Cities is, it's a national it's a national initiative by Bloomberg Philanthropies that's aimed at helping mid-sized cities really understand what their data can do for them through a variety of projects, either focused on open data, performance analytics, results-driven contracting to try to get more out of vendors and contracted dollars, as well as low-cost evaluations and behavioral insights, doing different sort of nudges to try to get better results out of the programs that they're already doing. So Nick and I are actually from the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. We focus more on the performance analytics and open data side of things. And so we're going to be talking about a few of our projects that we have with some of our city partners. And so the city that I'm talking about today is Fort Lauderdale. And so they had this challenge where they have an annual resident survey where they try to collect concerns from the community, try to gauge how they're doing in terms of filling needs and what the biggest priorities are going to be. And something that came up time and time again was that poor street lighting contributed to the sense of poor public safety. And there's a lot of research out there that does suggest that poorly lit areas also correlate with higher crime rates as well. And so looking at their current process, how their Parks and Recreation Department was going around and fixing poor street lighting was driving around and seeing where there were dark areas and then flagging that for service later on. And I think that this is something that many cities face where it's a very reactive process and they need to switch to a more proactive process to really head off problems before they become problems. And so what they wanted to do was really identify where those areas of greatest needs were so that they can go and give the resources that are required to the areas that aren't very well lit. So we were going to help them take a comprehensive map of their streetlights, create buffers around them for illumination to really identify where along the streets there were issues and which blocks were actually the darkest there. We could then take information about crime data and overlay that to see where the areas of biggest crime were and see if that correlates with any other sort of indicators to try to then rank these areas of need for repair and replacement and then and go from there. There's a lot of opportunities in the future for this as well, looking at infrastructure and expansion, so that when, if you look at business permits and where the city is going to grow in the future, you can then expand out the street lighting program and prioritize that as well. So now you're moving from the system where somebody calls in a complaint or a driver notices a street light that's out, to actually knowing where you have the biggest needs to go. And that's all well and good, but obviously there's a lot of challenges in trying to actually set this up, and I think we've hit upon some of these already, where the traditional model of government are departments focused on their own departmental work, delivering services to residents. And we're seeing this shift in cities where they're now focusing more on outcomes and trying to deliver better results for their citizens, regardless of which department is actually involved here. So you see these cross-departmental issue stat areas and trying to bring together multiple resources and different data sets to focus on this problem. And this is something that we noticed here as well, where when we went in, there wasn't really great data on streetlights to begin with. The last inventory of streetlights in the city was from 2007. And as we were starting to go through and put this together as well, we noticed that they weren't actually the only department that had ownership over streetlights as well. And so as we were finding these different overlaps, kind of the project grew and we needed to pull in more partners and try to build buy-in across city government to then get this project done as well. Additionally, trying to address security and privacy concerns around sensitive crime data and making sure that we're protecting people's identities and the privacy of victims that might have been influenced here, while still being able to extract those analytic insights as well. So a lot of these are common concerns for cities, and we talked a little bit about why can't we just create these data science teams within city governments and kind of go there. And I think that a lot of it is that you really need a catalyst to break out of that routine service delivery model where people are focused on their own. And sometimes that's an outside organization like Data Science for Social Good coming in and doing one of these projects and showing what can actually be done. Sometimes it's reacting to an event that they really need to respond to. And so for, we're kind of falling into the former camp with Data Science for Social Good, where we're coming in and now this conversation is starting about what can we do to improve streetlights, how can we drive this process forward in a way that this conversation really hadn't happened across departments before and identifying all of these issues. So we're really hopeful for the future, and we don't have results just yet, but we were hoping that we will have some to share with everybody this fall.
Great, thank you. All right, questions?
Yeah. How do you share the data? It's data of the people, by the people, for the people. So certain types of data, like the vacant property. In New York City, I think they have a website where they have a database online, and you can click on the thing, and it tells you what is wrong with the property, if there's any environmental issues. Have you thought about how to present this data to the public and sharing? And is there legal challenges, from the law department saying, you shouldn't be sharing this type of data?
Absolutely. And in terms of open data and trying to share data in general, all of these municipalities are subject to state laws and public records requests, and so most of this data is public data already. It just is going through a much more labor-intensive process to make it out there. And so Fort Lauderdale is actually involved with the White House Puts Data Initiative, and they're working on trying to release sensitive data in a responsible manner, where many cities are looking at this in terms of, we might not be able to release the exact latitude and longitude or street address of where this crime might have happened, but we can release sort of the block level information about where this is happening in the city, and moving forward from there. In terms of how do you visualize a specific project around, streetlights and things like that, you get the points for the streetlights that are around, and you can identify what the area of illumination would be. So we used a 50-meter radius around that. From there, you can also plot out the points that are at least the block layer points of the crime data to see, for the blocks that are not well illuminated, how many crimes are happening within that polygon area there as well. So you can start seeing that you can create these heat maps or hex binning maps that you can choropleth around and try to visualize where these areas of greatest needs are. But then you can take that a step farther and also say, this is the priority areas for the city where we're focusing on, and this is the reason behind that as well. And that sort of two-way communication, not just here's what's happening, but here's what we're doing about it, and we're thinking ahead to the next step, is something that we think will really speak to the public through these community surveys, and we're looking forward to getting the results back once we have more information about the impact that we've had.
One of the areas I like about all the discussions, and this kind of goes to what Mike was talking about, I'm also in education, and so a lot of the work has always been identifying risk after it happens. How do we help this student because they have a discipline issue? How do you help this student because of attendance or whatever? And looking at the work that DSSG has done, it's looking at how do you identify it before it happens? It's a preventive measure. And it kind of goes to what you were talking about with Syracuse. One of the areas that we're looking at in Tulsa, and it's been a slow process, but it's getting people looking at school issues as community issues. But not trying to maybe solve the poverty issue, but identifying, how do kids get into poverty? How do they become a high-need student from a high-need family and prevent more? So you identify how to prevent more, although it's not fair to the ones that are already there, but if you can prevent more going there, then you can start working back as how do we slowly bring people out of that situation. And I think what you're addressing on the What City Work, is kind of looking at that as how can we do it in a more proactive manner instead of consistently being reactive. I guess one of the things I joke about being in education is that I came from the real world where, when you're running a business or you're working in a corporation, you're proactively trying to improve what you're doing. Where in most government entities, whether it's city, education or whatever, it's much more of a reactive, how can we solve this problem because this person's complaining. And I like the work that I see, but I also see where so much of it all ties together. And you're right about the silos, but it's not even silos within departments, it's silos within branches of government organizations.
And I think a common thread also is trying to improve the efficiency of whatever system we're looking at. And a lot of it is prioritizing in an objective way, right? So not fixing the lights that most people complain about, right? Or in most wealthy neighborhoods, people like about a light that's out versus not. Or somebody reporting and it comes from this neighborhood, this district, and you need to pay more attention there. But there's data that says, here's the prediction for the cost of not fixing this, right? Or here's the prediction for what's going to happen down the line, the impact that we anticipate, right? The best models we built, it's not perfect, but now we have a additional data point to make a better decision.
And I think, a lot of times, or I guess starting from a different point, this is why we're all here in terms of data science, was that we're looking at how to apply this for social good. And a lot of times, the default is to really default back onto these outputs rather than these outcomes. And so, looking at this project, we're not just looking at, where is the street light going to go out so that we can go and replace the bulb before anything bad happens. It's really trying to focus on delivering a result for the community that's going to improve people's lives. And I think that that's the key tie-in for a lot of this as well, is not just looking at efficiency or how can we, prioritize our list so that we're getting things done quicker, but, how is this actually impacting our community, and how can we ensure that we're not just counting things, but we're actually driving towards a goal.
Can I say one thing about that, though? This kind of made me think about this. So, I understand and totally agree as far as what you said about reactivity being sort of the premise of government work. I think that there's a real danger in work like this in data science to focus a lot on how can we not just sort of predict when and how things will happen, but also how can we assess an entire structure and fix the structure. And my background, I'm a lawyer. That's sort of my background. So I definitely understand that thinking. But just because we can sit here and talk about how we can fix the structure and how we can, kind of prevent things from happening or predict them, most people working in government don't have that luxury. And so I think that there's a real need in data science to say, look, we recognize that we can build a predictive model for you, but we also really have to talk about how you're managing what you have to do reactively, because that doesn't go away just because I think that it should or because I want it. I don't think anyone here would contest that or would disagree with that, but I think customer service requests or service requests don't go, or situations that require reaction don't disappear just because I want to invest my time and my sort of mental energy in predictive analytics or in proactive, structural systemic change. So I think that accounting for reactivity necessarily has to be a step in that process. I didn't mean to cut off what you were saying, and I think this is very much in line with what you were saying, but I think that's something that maybe this is, I've been in government too long or something, but I feel very defensive of people working in government in that sense, because I think that in theory, thinking of things totally, from a system standpoint and as a proactive endeavor is great, but on the ground it doesn't look like that. And I think that's really important to sort of keep in mind.
And just to also kind of play off of that, a lot of these projects that we've talked about are these predictive analytics projects. There's a whole other branch of descriptive analytics that is hugely important to how city governments work. And understanding, what is going on in your city and getting that sort of clarity and insight, is what makes a city function day to day.
I was wondering if you went into the work also thinking about strategies if the model failed to predict or the model failed to explain what you're aiming to. So I work with the city of South Bend in Indiana, and we actually did an evaluation of a public lighting program with crime data, and there's no statistical significance in decreasing crime. And now we're kind of with the question, what do we go and tell the city council that their $200,000 program doesn't work, right? So I was wondering if you.
Sure. So I think that there's two components to the project here that we're testing at once. Is public safety, but also the perception of public safety, and both of these are also important to how people experience a city and how they perceive the quality of life for residents within the city as well. So you could probably go out and publish a paper and be like, look, there was no correlation here. You guys, you're overreacting. You're paranoid. Let's take a step back. But there's something else that's also speaking to that there is this concern that's coming up even without a correlation here. And so maybe this is kind of justification for, instead of pursuing an aggressive streetlight replacement program, for doing more community policing or trying to reach out and see where are the actual specific concerns and trying to see what is actually correlating with that. And how do you do public education, or how do you make a neighborhood feel safer in another way?
Yeah, and just a very quick comment before we go to the next speaker. I find that it's important, this kind of thing is important to address as you're structuring the project before you commence and you say, we're going to do this now. If we do the work and if we find out that there's no correlation, what's that going to look like, right? Are you guys going to change the program? Is this going to look bad? Is there a plan B, right? And that's the time to think about this. And you might say, your stakeholder might say, well, that's okay because the perception is also very important, right? We still want to tackle it. They might say, oh, well, in that case, we might want to hurry with that research now before we make more decisions and we don't often have the luxury, sometimes you get involved in the project halfway, right? But when possible, I think that's a very good approach that will solve a lot of other issues. All right. And our last but not least speaker, Nick Hadji George, Woodward Cities also, and Jackson.
Great, thanks everyone. Yeah, so I don't know if I can say what hasn't already been said. But,
Oh, all right.
no, all these projects touch on, like, I think what are some fundamental.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes, I think all of what we've heard so far has been, really touching on the core of what are the challenges that you will face in these projects. Just to talk about what I've been working on the past couple of months. We had a discussion with Jackson, Mississippi, to help them. The mayor. Thanks. The mayor was very interested in finding ways to increase operational efficiencies within their city government. So that was basically looking at their budget and seeing where they're spending too much money, where they're spending not enough money. So we basically, it wasn't so much of a predictive project, more of a descriptive one. And the first step was to find out what does operational efficiency look like. That involved us finding which cities are structurally, demographically, economically similar to Jackson, and then looking at their budgets and just seeing how they compare. And then from this, we've basically been creating, or in the process of creating a decision support tool to basically give this information to the leaders in the city, who will then use that to inform their budget decisions. Because before, I mean, this is probably true in almost every city, but budgets are the most instinctual, gut-driven processes that the city has been doing forever. It's really hard to change those and use data to do them in a more objective and priority-driven way. It's a very tribal thing among the departments to find money. But that's the project. Challenges, I mean, the data is very difficult to work with. I don't know if you've looked at a budget document in recent years, but it's just, it's a PDF, a lot of text. Not so much on the number side of things, but so this was a challenge. We also, like I think we just hit on one of the biggest challenges was how do we deal with the possibility that the results are unpleasant and difficult to swallow. So I think that's something that is very important to talk about at the beginning of any analytics project. What are we prepared to deal with after we're done? And I think one thing that we've been really lucky to have in Jackson is really strong executive buy-in from the mayoral level. So that definitely has been very important in bringing the departments together, in sharing their information, and sort of getting on the same page about what to do with this information when it's available. So I mean, this project wouldn't have been possible without that. So I think definitely a big challenge to overcome. The project is about midway right now. We are still working on getting the metrics for comparison between cities finalized, but it's been very fun and very interesting. And it's also budget season right now, so I mean, they probably won't be able to use this to inform all of their current budget decision making for this fiscal year, but after implementing this tool, we'll be able to see what happens next year and compare to this year, which is very exciting. So, happy to take any questions.
Great. Might have run out of questions. No, we have not.
My question is given the work you're doing on these projects, I mean, have you started to tie them, or are you looking as far as a bigger framework? I mean, the third gentleman spoke about education. I mean, you mapped out where you've gone. Sort of now you've got a huge decision warehouse. I mean, and you're talking about at-risk students. Is there is there maybe a bigger picture where you're gonna say, we should be managing, instead we should be demographic and managing all students? In other words, yes, this one's fine, we don't have to change anything, this student is good to kind of take me to her point, rather than just saying, picking out the bad apples. It's like, should we not be managing our school system on the basis of data? In terms of getting information, it's like, are you thinking about Internet of Things projects where you're actually then getting good data? Like if sewers are clogging up, then means water levels should be rising. What if it should be sent somewhere to be actually proactive? I mean, are people actually starting to think in terms of bigger strategies to then give you guys the data than scripted and predictive?
I want to add real quick here. I think, stepping way back, as I said, that there's lots of things we can ask of the data. Once the data is presented to us in a form that we can ask questions. So much of our struggles out there is that the data are just not any good. They're in forms that you can't extract them except in very Herculean ways. You don't, things aren't tied together in any meaningful ways. The data are enormously dirty, and you don't know where it's at. So I think part of the thing at the government level, at the university level, and so on like that, there almost has to be this stepping back to the basic infrastructure. What do we need to do in order to develop a robust data system that informs? Because I spend so much of my time just trying to get my hands on some data that we could reasonably clean and integrate and follow over time. The literature talks about this stuff all the time, except when you go out there and look at it, you find it doesn't exist. And so part of the thing is that the default is, let's put it in on a piece of paper. Well, let's write it down somewhere. Or let's go ahead and use this variable name for this, and we'll change that, and then we'll archive it. I mean, it's a zoo out there. So I think fundamentally, when you look fundamentally over the long term, and we're dealing with the here and now, we've got to do this. But over the long term, there's a whole educational piece here at the university level, at the government level, to really look hard at those components of data infrastructure. How do you build it? How do you maintain it? How do you use it? How do you safeguard it? How do you train people to ask good questions of the data?
These old systems, I mean, you talk about reprocessing text fields, that sounds like an old mainframe thing. It's like, I have like this update over here that I can retrieve this or something. Is that still a problem?
I mean, it's not even necessarily always old stuff. It's just sometimes even new vendors don't make data all that accessible.
Or the vendors
Or you don't.
our vendors are the primary, vendors host a lot of data. So that's a huge issue in government now. We contract out increasingly more data sets. What that means is we have 10 different contracts, we probably have 10 different data structures. And if we try, first of all, we have to make sure that in our contract we can get that data, which I fight this I go to bat with our vendors all the time over this, so that's the issue. And then we have to pull it in and see if it all looks the same. Probably it doesn't, because kind of until now, no one has written this into contracts. So that's like a big, it's not even like what is our data infrastructure internally, it's like how are we contracting with our vendors who host a lot of our data to make sure that they're giving us what we want.
So there's not some governmental standards that the vendors are competing together.
Well, they don't exist, and nobody's contracting for them. So we have to contract for them, because I think contracting out data sets or having other people host data is really good. We shouldn't, I don't want my city to be a server farm. Google can do that. I would rather that we, manage the city. You know what I'm saying? I think that what that means is we have to think about what are we asking for when we contract with vendors, and how do we make sure we're getting what we want, and then we're managing that. So
beyond just also the data ownership aspect, which is huge.
Yeah.
If you contract with a vendor, who owns the data that's produced out of that? It should be the city. It's also the interoperability aspect of that, trying to write in that you need to also interface with these other things, and that's sometimes asking a lot of large proprietary vendors that don't want to do that, and they want to keep you within their own sort of ecosystem and sphere. So there's a lot of challenges that kind of go around that, but I think going back to also your data collection, Internet of Things, I think that you said this is sort of where we want to go. Automated data collection eases a lot of burdens on frontline staff and improves data quality, but it's also very expensive. And so this is sort of a transition that we've been seeing And not to call out South Bend, but this is one of the great projects that I saw was the sewage overflow, where they were using smart sensors to rebalance the system in that way, and that saved a lot of money over having to replace the entire system. So when you're faced with those sorts of choices, I think that more cities are going to go the route of smart technology. But I don't think that we're necessarily there yet universally. There's still some cities that are transitioning off of paper ledgers into database systems. So there's still some ways to go sometimes. Yeah.
My concern is that, you have this tipping point. You guys are really a very small minority in terms of understanding anything about this issue. The great majority of people out there that have their fingers on data, whether it's accounting data or school data or whatever kind of data like that, they have no way of thinking like you do, except every once in a while, one of them gets excited about this, and then they go like hell to do this, and then they just don't go anywhere, just because the pragmatics of trying to take this on are so enormous. One of the things I think is compelling about this conference is the opportunity to network. They're building these data scientists, if you will, recognizing the power of it, but also realizing there's a huge amount of work to really get this to a level that we can meaningfully do things with it on a large scale. It's not happening in the schools yet. It's a long ways before it's going to happen in school. And she talked about this proprietary, these vendors that for their own self-serving interests lock it down, change the structure and everything else, make it extremely hard. I just ran into that not long ago. We changed vendor, this education, it blows up all the time about this test and that test and this, who's parks and the AIRs and so on like that. I'm telling you, you got to request access to all these data that sits all over the place, and maybe they'll get back around to you. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll send it to you in a certain way. Maybe you got to go back at it. But if you're not persistent about doing this and have some sense of what you can do with it when you get it like that, good luck. You're going to be kind of like, I'm not doing this. It's just not worth it.
It's similar to corporations in practice. That really works. Persistence is just a model.
So I have a question for Mike. Let's imagine that your co-panelists from Cincinnati and Syracuse decide that they need to have your predictive model to help kids on their way, and they rush back to their cities to implement. How much of the work that you've already done can they skip, right? Like it took years, right, to get your longitudinal data set. Do they have to do all that? Do they get to just pick up your algorithm? Like
in Cincinnati, that's it's a one-to-one because the data we're using are Ohio data, and then the code itself is open source. So one of the things that particular code will run these analysis. Because you don't have to say Mike Fuller. You can say 11623, as a sort of a hide for Mike Fuller. But Mike Fuller has all these characteristics. All this data flows in there. All the data that we pull, I should say about 95% of the data we pull are data that the district pulls. And we have some locally generated data that might not, might be sort of, anomalous, but, demographics, attendance, achievement, mobility things, all that kind of stuff that's in there, that whole pattern of stuff that's in there, kindergarten assessment stuff, first grade assessment. And what we've done too, that, again, this is kind of like, maybe a little bit too deep here in the weeds with this crap, but schools change assessments all the time. And you would think that a third grade assessment means this, and next year's third grade assessment means this, but it ain't so. If you change the test, you change the metric, you change the content, and so how do you compare third grade to third grade as far as the thing? Well, that's not a trivial thing. That's a pretty important thing. So you have to normalize all those tests from whenever like that. That's been done. All that normalization, or the means to normalize that, is all already pre-built into that like that. So schools don't have to go out there and do all the kind of, making sure that that relative ranking of that student on this test compares to that test like that. That's done. So it's open source, it's available, should Cincinnati want to, take that on. Syracuse, probably not.
Well, I'll just say, you are probably right to some degree, although I think, the benefit, at least from our project, and our fellows did a lot to document what process they followed, the technical details of it. So potentially, Cincinnati does not have the same exact data set relative to water mains that we do. But I think, we do have an output of what the likely factors are related to water main breaks, at least in Syracuse, and so you could potentially start to build that out and say, okay, in Syracuse, age does play a factor in why a water main likely breaks. So maybe applying it that way. So it may not be as easy as like just cloning the GitHub repo and plugging in new data and rerunning it. That probably would not work. But I do think that like some of the research that goes into it and the documentation of it can inform how to change things around of it to make it fit. You may have to sort of rebuild the model, but I think, and of course, like Syracuse is totally different than Cincinnati in a variety of ways, including weather and who even owns the system for us and that sort of thing. But I think it does get you on a path where it's like, well, maybe we don't need to consider these types of variables, so we don't have that data. Let's not worry about getting it, because in Syracuse they did this model that, you know, they also considered this kind of data. It didn't end up correlating with water main breaks, so maybe we don't need to worry about how do we get this digitized or how do we start collecting.
That's an important thing here about the documentation. I forgot to mention that. It's code one thing. The huge thing is that our fellows documented everything. They talked about all the variables and how they did like that. That's huge. I think that. So I appreciate you saying that, because anybody could take that and look at that and say, oh, we may not have that same data set, but here's how we did it.
And it's huge for two really huge reasons. One is not only do you want other cities or other jurisdictions to be able to, you know, fork it, but you want to be able to have the city itself and the people who work there carry that work on after you're finished with the project, which is a huge component of what we're doing in our cities, part of our model. It's just, you want these things to keep going and not die.
An unfortunate feature, I think, of some departments that rather than having a data dictionary, you have like a Joe the power user who knows everything. And then Joe retires or gets a new job, and then you're wondering, what are these codes?
And obviously very important to share within the organization. But I think sort of back to your point as well, how can other cities, states, countries take advantage of what has already been done? I think often there's a misconception, and I don't know if you guys are running to that, I'm curious to hear, that, oh, you have a model? Give us the model, we'll run the model, right? And the model is not a magical thing, right? And often the data is different, the question is different, how much historical data you have to work with is different, right? So it's not like, oh, you have a model, great, we'll take the model. But the important things are the lessons learned, right? And the best practices that you sort of establish, right? So what data was worth spending the time to get, what wasn't, what ended up, being a significant contributor to the success, and what wasn't, right? And, if you look back 2 years, it's not enough, but if you look back, 5, then you start to see some patterns, something like that, right? Things that other projects can take on and have a shortcut to kind of a successful trajectory. They still have to figure things out, they still have to write their code, they still have to run their models, but at least they're sort of standing on the shoulders of people who've been through that and already have some best practices and shortcuts. So please share and write white papers about what you do, and blog articles about 10 surprising things we found, or whatever format it is. Make sure that people hear about your assumptions and your methods, and not just well, everything is public on the GitHub, that's the GitHub repo. There you go. I think I saw hands up there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in the process of building some of your models, were there interesting discoveries of factors that you may not have been aware of that possibly apply outside the model? Like maybe, light intensity doesn't do anything, but the color of the light actually impacts crime, and we don't know why.
We haven't looked at that just yet, but it's a really fascinating question. So in my previous background was actually working on campaign data analytics, and one thing that we found also was that sometimes there's really interesting exotic variables. Well, we want them to have some sort of really big impact. Dog ownership does not actually predict who you're going to vote for, and instead, maybe gender has a much bigger impact on that. So it's also a factor of what is the most significant variable that's going to impact that, and trying to key in on that rather than necessarily the gravy that might influence it to a smaller degree. So it's also kind of this balance between I think somebody put it yesterday, the coders that are artists and perfectionists and the coders that are bubblegum and duct tape get out the first working product. So trying to achieve the most good in the quickest amount of time and then iterating from there.
And I would just say, and Ali, who is one of our fellows, can probably go into more detail on some of it, but I think what we sort of set out to do was take some of the assumptions that some of our staff makes about why water mains break and test that so that we could go back and say like, all right, it's time to stop talking about this now, or you can talk about it more. So there had always been this argument that like when we repave roads, the machines that are going over the roads like take off the asphalt, vibrate the road so much that it breaks the water mains. That would be like a huge issue if that was happening, because we'd have to reconsider how we do like a lot of work across a lot of different departments. And like just anecdotally looking at it, it was like, well, if this was really an issue, we'd have a lot of water main breaks in these specific areas, and like we just didn't. So one of our asks of our fellows was like, can you look at this as one of the potential factors so that we can see if it does factor in? And like it doesn't. So that's nice to be able to go back with. I think the other thing is just thinking through like.
That's how the cities know it. They don't spend time.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Trying to
And I think the
explore
other thing is like thinking through some of like what the factors are that might be proxies for other things. So like year that the water main was installed may not actually have as much to do with age. It might have more to do with material. It's just that that material was used during that year, and so like that's just the question that's being asked during the modeling process first. That does correlate more, but it really has something more to do with material. Is that right? Am I good? So I think that's kind of. So I think those kind of things are interesting and important for us to know when we go back and talk to our departments. Like we may say it's age, and that may be something to consider, but we may also need to know, and it would be important to know that like some mains could be older and last for 1,000 years, and it's just because that material was right. So only thinking about some of the things that the model put out, like it's important to know. It is important to know what it's talking about, and maybe that gets back to some of the black box discussion. It's like someone's got to know kind of what happened, because there could be some ways to misinterpret what the key factors are, just because like it's actually a proxy for something else.
I just want to point out we're at the top of the hour and a little over. So if anybody needs to leave, please feel free. And if there's more questions, don't have to say, keep going. But I don't want anybody to feel like they can't actually play. Any more questions? Oh, one more.
Well, I'm not quite sure what to do with this, but it's just it's the problem of unintended consequences. What made me think of it was the lighting. There's also a movement to, sort of a dark sky movement, and so, I guess I don't quite know what to do with it other than to ask, how do you handle unintended consequences, or how do you approach guarding against that, I guess?
I mean, it's very difficult to kind of guard against unintended consequences because they're unintended. Usually they result in that's fun. And so typically, this is just part of it is having situational awareness to discover them as they come up, and once they start improving street lighting across the city, maybe the top complaint is going to switch to something else, like there's too much light pollution in the city or something like that. But then there's also these sort of priorities for the city that you need to weigh as well in terms of what are the overall strategic objectives that you're striving for. In livability standards, folks that want to stargaze are probably a lower priority for a city than folks that want to feel safe as they walk around their neighborhood at night. And just trying to weigh those decisions are a really difficult part of what a mayor or city manager or city councilor do. And I'm glad that I don't need to step in and make that sort of strategic decision for them. We can just kind of go with what they say. But I think that what I said before, having this situational awareness to see where things are going to come up in reaction to that, and then starting to deal with that as well as part of what we were talking about with descriptive analytics and that reactive part of city government as well.
Something I wanted to ask here come up as an issue. I've seen this a lot in industry, and I'm curious if you see that in government as well. There are different departments and different groups, and they own certain parts of the business and the processes, and they're very possessive of their domains, right? And so they say, oh, how about
about, do I get the insight or do you get the insight, right? It's about, I don't care if I get the insight, I kind of like that, whatever, you know, it's like, do we all understand how this insight sort of manifested? And I think that when you frame it that way and you say, look, this is something that anyone can kind of understand. I strongly believe that. That's a really strong sort of, I hold that premise very strongly that data science can be understood. It's not this like elite, it's not something that sort of is like only for people with a certain amount of education. I think it's something that can be understood. And so I think the important thing is to say, you know, not I'm gonna take this and get an insight, this is what we're doing. I think we all need to understand what the inputs are. We all need to understand how we're kind of processing this in this model. And then we can talk about what the outcome is, or what the output is. I think in my experience, that's the only way that I've found to get around my ego versus someone else's ego, or my territory versus someone else's territory. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think also as cities are moving from you know, a very departmental service focus to a more outcome and issue focus, and as these cross-departmental meetings are starting to take place, there is more appetite for that data sharing to see, you know, what other departments are doing and how that relates to your own work, and you know, you're both striving towards the same end, but maybe, you know, in terms of trying to serve the homeless population, you didn't consider pulling in the libraries or parks and recreation or something like that. So there's some departments that do have touched these issues that aren't really pulled into that. And so top-down leadership is also very key, that commitment from the top and that signal to say, you know, this is something that's important to us and we want to take a broader view of how our city government is operating. So that kind of push definitely helps nudge people along towards that more open standard. But we've actually seen also through doing some data inventory from cities, when we ask departments about, you know, what is your data wish list from other departments, every department wants other departments' data as well. And so if you can say, you know, this isn't about getting a control over this. Right. So you can see, you know, there's open data portals that serve the community, but you think of maybe open data portals that serve internal purposes as well. So Kansas City, Missouri has a few quotes out there about how much an open data platform has helped break down interdepartmental silos and improve employee productivity, because now they don't have to, you know, call a department and they have to find the owner of that data, who then produces that data and sends it back to the owner. They can go directly to a source and download it themselves.
So in my world, sometimes data is a weapon, and people are enormously concerned about how that data might be used. It's suspect when you ask for the data, because there's a fear that you'll find something lacking in what's being done. So that's a driver, that, you know, there's a trust, and I think we talked about that relationship is extremely important. There has to be a level of integrity in terms of how you deal with others and so on. But there are a lot of folks out there in my world that are reluctant to share the data for fear that it will be used against them, not it will be used with them. So that's just going on out there. We just have to realize it and try to deal with it constructively.
There's also a lot that we can learn in terms of, you know, behavioral insights around this data analysis, where there tends to be, or conception of performance analytics especially, as being this gotcha culture of trying to enforce accountability and identify who's not prepared and who's not looking at this data. But you know, there's a lot of resources out there on things like appreciative inquiry, where you're really focused on not triggering the fight or flight amygdala response and trying to get at the question and do this in a collaborative manner, where you're trying to work together to solve common issues and overcome roadblocks together, and using this as an opportunity to elevate challenges rather than trying to cover things up or shift blame or shift the focus away from yourself as well.
And I think going back to like the roadblock for data access and sharing between different units in an organization, it's really, you know, more and more apparent as we go through these projects that data management, data cleanliness is such a huge prerequisite for these projects to be successful. So, you know, the data science is very fun and very, very interesting to work on, but you know, you gotta really spend time to prime the system for the analysis to even begin. So there's a lot of interesting work to do there.
All right, I think we've covered all questions, so feel free to come up to panelists, stop them during the breaks and other questions, but thank you very much for coming. Thank you very